Before we dive into our discussion about feedback connections to student success, let's explore a key concept that can help us understand the importance of developing and fostering self-perpetuating feedback loops throughout the classroom, school, university, and marketplace. This concept is the School of Business classroom as a dynamic learning system. Considering the dynamic learning system as a metaphor for adult development environments illuminates the role faculty feedback can play in generating growth in individuals, teams, and classes, and helps us recognize the levels of analysis in a classroom learning system so we can consciously leverage feedback for student success. In this segment of the Excellence in Feedback workshop, we'll consider how a system perspective can help faculties to foster dynamic growth at the individual, team, and classroom level. Explore the cellular level of the human brain to see how faculty feedback may influence development of new neurons and neural networks, which emerge as new behaviors and skills in adult learners. Next, we'll recognize how faculty feedback helps students to develop resilience and adaptability in a turbulent environment so they can excel in challenging academic and professional settings. We'll conclude this segment by asking you to apply the dynamic learning system metaphor to manage feedback interventions at individual, group, and classroom levels. Develop a process through which you can conduct interventions to solve common problems in the classroom. And finally, identify the university resources available to help you manage feedback at all levels of analysis in your dynamic learning system. General dynamic system theory provides three levels of analysis for a system: macro, meso, and micro. System survival and growth depend on the dynamic interaction of the components within the system and the system's ability to adapt to, influence, and exchange resources with the environment. This dynamic interaction of components is the basis of the open system model introduced by Bertalanffy back in 1969. The system perspective is highly influential in the fields of organizational behavior, organizational psychology, integrative psychology, and change leadership. Also, system theory influences contemporary leadership and organizational development perspectives, like those expressed by Peter Sang in The Fifth Discipline and Margaret Wheatley in Leadership in the New Sciences. The system perspective is gaining strengthened interest as neurology illuminates the integration of mind, brain, and education as a complex, dynamic developing system that cannot be understood by analyzing components in isolation with the systems in which they exist. In other words, the integration of neurology, psychology, and education are emphasizing that development is a dynamic and integrative process. The learning is not a linear process, and the activities and components of a system are interconnected. They do not exist in isolation of others. Now, understanding this dynamic process can help us more effectively manage learning in the classroom and performance at work. Through the system perspective, interdependent components with distinct boundaries dynamically interact to make a system more than its subsequent parts. Important claims of general system theory for us to consider are that system principles apply to systems regardless of their components or environment, and the system perspective explores wholes, not parts. And the universe is comprised of a hierarchy of systems within systems. This would mean that laws that apply to a cell would also apply to a human system, to the Earth system, to the planetary system, to the universe system, and so on. Applied to the University of Phoenix School of Business, the classroom becomes a dynamic learning system that consists of individuals, micro, groups, meso, and class, macro, dynamically interacting in a classroom to accomplish individual and group goals. Determining the viability of the classroom as a dynamic learning system requires that the faculty conduct analysis and intervention at the individual, group, and classroom levels. The School of Business instructor accomplishes this analysis through individual and team assessments, instructor observation, and collaboration with the learners. However, analyzing the classroom as an isolated closed system would likely inhibit relevance of classroom activities because it does not consider the context in which the classroom and its activities operate. To understand the classroom as a dynamic learning system requires understanding the classroom as part of a school, which is part of the university, which is part of a market, which is part of a nation, which is part of a global economy, and so on. Now, from the student's perspective, the classroom operates within the University of Phoenix, which exists within a market, which will provide the student with career opportunities if he or she can develop knowledge and skills in the classroom that are of value in the market. Put differently, understanding the dynamics inside the classroom also requires recognition of dynamically interacting culture, society, economy, and industry on the development of individuals, groups, and processes inside the classroom learning system. Awareness of what is happening at the cellular level of each student during feedback events can help illuminate the importance of effectively managing feedback at the micro, meso, and macro levels to influence what occurs at the microscopic level. Emerging discoveries in neurology are helping to clarify how facilitating growth through challenge and feedback helps assure individual adaptability and learning. The image you see here is a rendition of a microscopic view of a process that occurs in the hippocampus called neurogenesis. Neurogenesis is a revolutionary discovery that suggests important implications for learning, development, and creative longevity, while helping to emphasize the role of feedback in student growth. The hippocampus is part of our brain that plays a fundamental role in memory and learning by filtering and categorizing experience, then reassembling data as memories. Princeton neurologist Elizabeth Gould recently discovered that the hippocampus is also a brain cell factory that daily generates numerous stem cells. Through neurogenesis, stem cells act like seeds of new brain cells that, if properly challenged, can ultimately help with learning complex tasks. Our actions, choices, and relations determine if those stem cells sprout to become viable brain cells or if those stem cells dissolve. In other words, our behavior, choices, and interactions rewire and reorganize the brain. Doing nothing means the seeds of development liquefy and we start to decay. In short, the day we stop actively learning is the day our brains start to die. In other words, actively learning and making correct decisions encourages new stem cells to strengthen, sprout branches that connect with existing brain cells, and become viable cells that foster creative longevity and perpetual development. This suggests a key to fostering lifelong growth. Choose challenge. As suggested by Hebrew University neurologist Eden Segev, the more challenging the task, the more neurons we develop. These neurons associate with new behaviors and improvement. Now, this discovery of neurogenesis suggests important implications for our own perpetual development through active learning and for fostering student potential through feedback. In the School of Business classroom, faculties don't stop at communicating and enforcing high expectations. They go beyond by pointing out disconnects between performance and expectations to help students recognize essential connections among assignments, activities, and relations within the classroom. Awareness of these connections helps students relate classroom activities to academic success, professional growth, and adaptability in an increasingly turbulent national and global environment. Faculty feedback helps students to turn these outputs of one activity into the inputs of others, to make connections among classroom activities in the real world, and to build connections in the brain. This dynamic interaction among faculty, students, teams, and class generates dynamic feedback loops that foster academic growth, professional success, and creative longevity. Before moving on, please reflect for a moment on the following in preparation for collaboration with your colleagues. First, considering the classroom as a dynamic learning system, how can you manage feedback interventions to influence student development at the individual, group, and classroom level? Next, considering a common problem you see in your courses like integrity, research, participation, teamwork, APA, and the like. Develop a process through which you can conduct a feedback intervention at the individual, team, classroom, and university levels to solve the problem. How can you use a system perspective to help students connect classroom activities to personal and professional success? Identify the university resources you can leverage to manage feedback events at individual, group, and classroom levels. For more information on the topics covered in this presentation, please see the following sources. Thanks for watching. Now let's get back to the classroom to collaborate.